If you look at a human through the eyes of the Vesperan Empire, you see a biological joke. Humans possess no venomous fangs, no kinetic-absorbing hide, and no capability for telepathic warfare. Their lifespans are a fleeting blip on the cosmic calendar, and their flesh tears under the slightest pressure. When the High Council of Vesper looked at Earth, they didn't see warriors. They saw eager diplomats, quiet clerks, and humble farmers. They saw a race of soft, fragile creatures who needed the broad shoulders of an apex predator species to survive in a hostile galaxy. Princess Cassandra of the Vesperan royal house had believed that lie for 3 long years. From the high marble terrace of the royal spire, Cassandra looked down into the lush central courtyard. Below her, knelt her husband, Arthur. He was hunched over a plot of dark, rich soil, holding a pair of rusted, earth-made pruning shears in his dirt-stained hands. He wore a faded linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing arms that bore no lethal bio-augmentations or combat tattoos. He was humming a slow, forgotten tune from his home planet, meticulously snipping dead leaves from a cluster of blooming blue hydrangeas. He looked completely out of place. The Vesperan estate was an architectural triumph of soaring crystalline spires, cascading kinetic waterfalls, and polished obsidian floors. It was a fortress dressed as a palace, inhabited by a warlike species that viewed physical dominance as the only valid currency in the universe. Vesperans stood well over 7 feet tall, boasted dense muscle structures, and carried themselves with the ruthless arrogance of born conquerors. Then there was Arthur. Arthur was 5'10" on a good day. His brown hair was thinning at the crown, he had soft laugh lines permanently etched around his pale blue eyes. And he had an infuriating habit of apologizing whenever someone else bumped into him in the corridors. "He is playing in the dirt again, Your Highness." Cassandra didn't need to turn around to know the voice belonged to Captain Leo. The commander of the Royal Guard stood stiffly by the terrace archway, his heavy battle armor humming with a faint, localized energy shield. The sheer contempt in the veteran's voice was barely disguised. "He is cultivating the soil, Leo," Cassandra replied smoothly, keeping her voice calm and authoritative. "It is a human tradition. They find it grounding. He has 36 automated droids for agricultural maintenance, Princess," Leo scoffed quietly, adjusting his heavy plasma sidearm. "Not to mention an entire staff of foreign botanists. It is humiliating to see a prince consort with dirt beneath his fingernails." The High Court whispers. "They say you married a peasant." Cassandra's jaw tightened. "My father arranged this union to secure the Earth Alliance trade corridors and agricultural supply lines. The court can murmur all they want, so long as our grain silos remain full." She turned away from the guard and descended the polished steps toward the garden. It was true, their marriage was purely political. A transactional exchange of imperial legitimacy for Earth's advanced terraforming tech and massive grain reserves. When King Alaric had first introduced her to her future groom, Cassandra had felt a sharp pang of disappointment. She had been raised on epic sagas of honor-bound warlords and blood oaths. Instead, she had been given a quiet human man who brought her a single pressed wildflower on their wedding night. "Arthur," she called softly. The human paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty forearm. He turned around, and a wide, genuine smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Cassie. Look at this," he said, pointing enthusiastically at a tiny green beetle crawling along a leaf. "The native soil microbes are integrating perfectly with the earth flora. The soil pH is finally stabilizing. We're going to have full blooms by next month." Cassandra looked down at the tiny bug, then at her husband's glowing face. He was so incredibly earnest, so utterly free of malice, that her chest tightest with a conflicting mix of affection and deep pity. She cared for him deeply. Over the last 3 years, Arthur had been nothing short of a devoted, gentle companion. When the vicious politics of the Vesperan court gave her migraines, he brewed warm chamomile tea. When she returned exhausted from diplomatic summits, he listened quietly without judgment. But he was weak. She had seen the way the court nobles sneered at him. She had seen how he flinched during ceremonial hunts, refusing to even touch a plasma rifle. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she would spend the rest of her life protecting this delicate human from the brutal realities of her world. "You should wash up," Cassandra said gently, reaching out to brush a speck of mud from his cheek. His skin was warm, soft, and human. "The planetary governor arrives for the state dinner in 2 hours. You need to wear the ceremonial gold sash." Arthur sighed, a light-hearted, self-deprecating sound. "Ah, yes. The heavy gold one that scratches my neck like broken glass. The very same. For you, Cassie," he grinned, standing up and dusting off his knees. He gathered his pruning shears and his wooden basket of clippings. As he passed Captain Leo at the archway, Arthur offered a polite nod. "Evening, Captain." Leo stared straight ahead, completely ignoring the gesture. Arthur didn't mind. He simply kept walking down the vaulted hall, whistling his quiet, tuneless melody. Cassandra watched him go, a heavy sigh escaping her lips. She would have to keep a sharp eye on the governor tonight. The man was a notorious provocateur. If he insulted Arthur at the dinner table, Arthur would likely just smile, bow his head, and offer him more wine. Cassandra would have to be the one to bare her teeth. It was her duty to be the shield. She just wished, just once, that her husband knew how to hold a sword. The attack did not begin with a battle cry or an emergency broadcast. It arrived during the third course of dessert. The planetary governor was in the middle of a loud, arrogant story about a recent mining conquest, gesturing wildly with a glass of spiced wine. Cassandra was sitting beside him, politely feigning interest while resting her hand on her lap. To her right sat Arthur, wearing his itchy golden sash, quietly cutting a pear into perfectly uniform, symmetrical slices with a butter knife. The grand dining hall was bathed in the warm, ambient glow of floating crystalline chandeliers. Then, reality shattered. A deafening, metallic shockwave violently ripped through the eastern wing. The massive, reinforced blast windows exploded inward, raining millions of razor-sharp glass shards over the dining room. Before the screaming could fully erupt, an invisible, high-frequency electromagnetic pulse, EMP, wave tore through the room. The kinetic energy shields protecting the palace flickered, groaned, and violently collapsed. The floating chandeliers instantly died, dropping like lead weights onto the marble tables. Darkness swallowed the hall for half a heartbeat, before harsh, crimson emergency strobes flickered to life, bathing the rising smoke and airborne dust in rhythmic flashes of blood-red light. Ambush! Captain Leo roared from the entrance, drawing his glowing plasma blade. Cassandra was hurled off her chair by a secondary concussive force. Her head slammed against the floor, and a high-pitched ringing drowned out the shrieks of the panicked serving staff. She scrambled onto her hands and knees, her expensive silk dress tearing on shattered crystal. Through the thick crimson haze, heavy tactical boots struck the floor. They weren't Vesperan rebels. They were men clad in pitch black, heavy-plated void armor. Their faces were completely concealed behind sleek, featureless visor helmets. They moved with a chilling, mechanical synchronization that sent a spike of primal terror through Cassandra's heart. The governor scrambled to his feet, shouting for his personal honor guard. The lead intruder didn't even slow his pace. He raised a heavy, matte black firearm, a brutal, primitive kinetic slug thrower designed to bypass energy shields entirely. Thud. Thud. 2 massive lead rounds punched through the governor's chest. The impact caved his ribcage inward, hurling his lifeless body across the table like a ragdoll. Cassie, down. A pair of hands violently grabbed Cassandra's shoulder, yanked her off her feet, and hauled her behind the massive, overturned oak dining table just as a heavy volley of solid metal rounds shredded the stone wall behind them. The grip on her shoulder was astonishingly firm. It felt like a clamp of forged iron. Cassandra gasped, reaching for the small, ceremonial dagger she kept strapped to her thigh, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Across the smoky hall, Captain Leo and 3 royal guards engaged the intruders. Vesperan warriors were formidable up close. Leo closed the distance in a flash of speed, swinging his plasma sword and cleaving the first mercenary in half. But the remaining attackers didn't flinch. They didn't panic. They simply adjusted their firing lines with terrifying, robotic precision. A crossfire of heavy kinetic rounds tore through Leo's armor, shattering his collarbone and ripping through his chest. The proud captain collapsed into his own blood, his glowing sword deactivating as it hit the stone. Within 10 seconds, the rest of the royal guard lay dead on the floor. Cassandra felt a freezing, paralyzing horror grip her throat. Elite Vesperan shock troopers, slaughtered in seconds. These weren't local militia. These were professional, cold-blooded death squads. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling violently. She turned to look at her husband, expecting to find him cowering, crying, or frozen in blind panic. Instead, Arthur was crouching beside her, peering through a small crack in the overturned oak table. His eyes were wide, but they were not filled with fear. They were dead, cold, and tracking. His gaze darted methodically from mercenary to mercenary, calculating their footwork, tracing their firing angles, and measuring their distances. 3 holding the doorway. 2 advancing on the flanks, Arthur muttered under his breath, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Standard military breach and clear. They're funneling us toward the east exit." "What?" Cassandra stammered, completely bewildered by the sudden, flat tone in his voice. "We can't head for the subterranean bunker," Arthur said, turning his head to look at her. The warm, soft smile was completely gone. His face was a blank, hollow slate. "They've compromised the central security grid. The bunker is a kill box. The bunker is reinforced durasteel," she hissed. "It's a trap," he corrected sharply. "We go to the greenhouse. The greenhouse is made of glass. It has cover. And it has exits they haven't mapped." Before Cassandra could argue, a loud, synthetic voice boomed through a helmet-mounted speaker, echoing over the sound of alarms. The voice spoke in flat, crisp Earth English. "Penhaligon. We know you're in here. Command sends their regards." Cassandra froze. Penhaligon. That was Arthur's surname. These death squads hadn't invaded the royal palace to assassinate a Vesperan princess or stage a political coup. They were here for the quiet human who painted watercolors and pruned roses. "Mark," Arthur whispered. Before Cassandra could parse the word, Arthur grabbed a heavy silver serving platter from the debris and hurled it across the room. It clattered violently against the far stone pillar with the force of a grenade impact. The mercenaries instantly snapped their weapons toward the sound. In that microsecond of visual distraction, Arthur grabbed Cassandra's wrist, hoisted her to her feet, and pulled her into a dead sprint. They bolted into the dark archway of the servants' corridor a fraction of a second before a storm of heavy kinetic slugs pulverized the stone doorway behind them, showering their backs with pulverized concrete and white dust. Cassandra ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her lungs burning, her torn silk dress catching on dark corners. But Arthur moved beside her with a smooth, terrifying glide. He wasn't stumbling. He wasn't gasping for air. His footing on the blood-slicked tiles was flawless, his body moving with a predatory efficiency that defied every memory she had of him. He navigated the maze-like back alleys of the palace without a single second of hesitation, taking blind corners with dark precision until they burst through the double doors into the royal greenhouse. The air inside was hot, thick, and humid, rich with the heavy scents of wet earth and crushed blue orchids. Sunlight had long faded, leaving the massive glass dome above filtering only the pale, icy moonlight over the dense, jungle-like foliage. Arthur let go of her hand. "Hide," he ordered softly. "Arthur, they have military-grade armor. They have guns." Cassandra pleaded, clutching her small ceremonial dagger with white knuckles. "We hide together. They're a Blackwood Black Ops extraction team," Arthur said, his tone eerily flat as he walked toward his wooden potting bench in the center of the room. "They don't leave survivors. If you hide with me, you die." He unbuttoned his torn gold sash, let it fall to the floor, and stripped off his blood-stained linen shirt. Under the pale moonlight filtering through the glass ceiling, Cassandra saw her husband's bare chest and back clearly for the first time, and her breath hitched in her throat. She had always assumed the few marks she had seen on his shoulders were from childhood accidents or rough farming work. She was wrong. His torso was a terrifying tapestry of violent history. Jagged entry wounds, chemical burn scars, white lines from high-frequency blade slashes, and across his spine, the unmistakable star-shaped crater left by a high-velocity railgun grazing. His body wasn't that of a quiet farmer, it was a hardened canvas of industrial slaughter. Arthur reached down and picked up the rusted pair of pruning shears from the bench. He turned the metal over in his hand, testing its weight, his fingers locking into the worn grip. Heavy, rhythmic combat boots echoed down the stone hallway outside the greenhouse. "Cassie," Arthur said, without looking back. His voice was no longer the soft, gentle baritone that made her tea. It was a cold, hollow sound, like a steel vault door locking out the sun. "Close your eyes." The heavy double doors of the greenhouse were kicked inward. 3 heavily armored mercenaries stepped into the humid air, their kinetic assault rifles raised, green laser sight lines sweeping the dark ferns and hanging ivy. Cassandra crouched low behind a massive, ancient oak barrel, holding her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't close her eyes. She couldn't. She expected Arthur to try to negotiate. She expected him to raise his hands, to offer himself up to save her. Arthur stood in the exact center of the main aisle. Bare-chested, covered in ancient scars, holding a rusted pair of garden shears. The lead mercenary halted, his visor shifting as he scanned Arthur. A harsh, metallic laugh crackled through his helmet's external speaker. "Look at you," the mercenary taunted, his voice dripping with dark amusement. "The ghost of New Mombasa. Playing farmer in the dirt. Damien said you'd gone soft, Penhaligon." "Gregory," Arthur said. His voice was a flat line. No anger, no fear, no adrenaline. "You are out of your jurisdiction. This is sovereign Vesperan territory. We're a long way from the Earth Alliance, Artie." "Nobody gives a damn about a few dead Xenos," Gregory sneered, raising his rifle and aiming the laser sight directly at the center of Arthur's chest. "Time to come home. Dead or alive, the bounty pays the exact same." Arthur tilted his head slightly. "You should have brought more men, Gregory." "Pull the trigger," Gregory barked to his men. Cassandra opened her mouth to scream, but the sound died in her throat as a muzzle flash illuminated the dark room. Arthur wasn't there. In a movement so violently fast her eyes couldn't track the transition, Arthur dropped his center of gravity, slipping entirely beneath the firing arc. Heavy kinetic slugs shredded the air where his chest had been a millisecond prior. He didn't retreat. He exploded forward. Arthur closed the 20 feet between them before Gregory could even lower his barrel. He hit the armored mercenary like a freight train, not with a wild, desperate tackle, but with calculated, lethal geometry. Arthur's left palm struck Gregory's rifle, slapping the barrel violently upward and off target, while his right hand drove the rusted pruning shears straight upward into the narrow, unarmored joint beneath the mercenary's armpit. He didn't just stab. Arthur twisted the blades with brutal leverage and wrenched sideways. Gregory shrieked, a wet, bubbling sound, as the rusted iron severed his main artery and punctured his lung. Without pausing for a fraction of a second, Arthur used the dying man's forward momentum, grabbing the heavy body armor and spinning him around as a human shield just as the other 2 mercenaries opened fire. A hail of lead tore into Gregory's back plate. Holding the dead weight with one arm, Arthur reached with his free hand, grabbed a heavy ceramic pot filled with scalding liquid fertilizer off a heating rack, and hurled it with terrifying precision. The pot shattered directly against the second mercenary's faceplate. Corrosive, superheated agricultural chemicals washed over his visor, instantly eating through the suit's rubberized neck seals. The man dropped his rifle, clawing frantically at his throat, screaming as the acid burned into his flesh. The third mercenary panicked. The icy discipline of an elite Black Ops team vanished in the face of raw, unfathomable carnage. He backpedaled violently, firing his rifle in wild, erratic bursts, shredding rare orchids and shattering glass panels above. Arthur dropped Gregory's corpse. He didn't charge the third man. He simply vanished into the thick shadows of the jungle flora. A suffocating silence descended on the greenhouse, broken only by the whimpering of the chemical-burned man on the floor and the steady, rhythmic drip-drip of the humidity misters. Cassandra pressed her back against the damp barrel, her mind fracturing. Who was this man? The soft human who spent hours gently nursing a bird with a broken wing back to health had just dismantled 3 heavily armored killers in under 6 seconds using garden tools. Penhaligon, the last mercenary, screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror as he spun in circles, his rifle tracking shadows. Come out. A soft rustle came from above. Before the mercenary could raise his eyes, Arthur dropped from the iron scaffolding of the glass roof. He landed silently on the man's shoulders, wrapping his legs around his neck in a single fluid motion born of 10,000 hours of muscle memory. Arthur applied an agonizing, sharp torque. Crack. The sound echoed through the humid greenhouse like a rifle shot. The mercenary's body went completely limp, dropping to the stone floor like a sack of stones. Arthur rolled off the falling body, coming up on one knee. He slowly stood up. He was covered in blood, most of it Gregory's. He looked down at the second mercenary, who was still squirming on the floor, tearing at his ruined throat. Arthur walked over, picked up a dropped assault rifle, and smoothly, without a hint of hesitation or malice, brought the heavy steel stock down on the man's head. The whimpering stopped. Arthur exhaled a long, slow breath. The tension in his broad shoulders visibly drained away. He looked around at the ruined greenhouse, taking in the shattered pots and the dark blood pooling over the terracotta tiles. Damn it, Arthur whispered softly to himself. The hydrangeas. Cassandra slowly stood up from behind the barrel, her legs shaking so violently she had to hold on to the wood to keep from collapsing. The ceremonial dagger slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly onto the stone floor. Arthur's head snapped toward the noise. For a fraction of a second, his eyes were dead, feral, locking onto a target with cold lethality. Then he blinked. The predator vanished, tucked instantly away into whatever dark box it had come from, and her mild, gentle husband returned. Cassie. He breathed, dropping the rifle. He took a quick step toward her, his face twisting with genuine, frantic concern. Are you hurt? Did they hit you? He reached out his hands toward her. Cassandra flinched. She couldn't help it. She took a step back, pressing herself flat against the cold brick wall. She looked at his hands, the hands that made her tea, the hands that rubbed her shoulders when she was tired. They were dripping with fresh crimson. Arthur froze. He looked down at his blood-soaked hands, then at her terrified face. A profound, unbearable sadness washed over his features. He slowly lowered his arms. I'm sorry, he whispered. His voice was soft again. Human. Fragile. I really thought. I thought I left him behind. I really did. Who? Cassandra's voice was barely a rasping whisper. Who are you? Arthur looked down at the dead men at his feet. I was a cleaner for the Alliance. A problem solver. Before the treaty. Before I asked out. He looked back up at her, his pale blue eyes pleading for understanding. I just wanted to grow things, Cassie. For the rest of my life. I just wanted to make things grow instead of killing them. Cassandra looked from her husband to the dead mercenaries. Elite, heavily armored killers, slaughtered in seconds. She remembered the sneers of her father's court. She remembered Captain Leo's arrogance, "They say you married a peasant." A cold, absolute realization settled over her Vesperan soul. She hadn't married a fragile diplomat. She hadn't married a soft creature that needed protecting. Humanity hadn't sent Vesper a lamb. They had sent a monster. And for the first time since the attack began, Cassandra felt completely, utterly safe. The palace was bleeding. High above the subterranean corridors, emergency sirens wailed in the distance, a low, mournful synthetic howl that vibrated through the cracked marble floors. The air tasted of copper, ozone, and pulverized stone. Cassandra walked 3 paces behind Arthur, her eyes locked on the broad span of his bare shoulders. He had retrieved a discarded mercenary assault rifle and moved through the shadows with a terrifying, fluid grace. He didn't walk, he prowled. Every step was deliberate, rolling silently from heel to toe to mask his approach. She felt like she was following a ghost. The man she had married would have been trembling, asking for her guidance, clutching her arm for safety. This man was clearing corners with brutal efficiency, his rifle tucked tight against his cheek, his finger resting a fraction of a millimeter from the trigger guard. "Clear," Arthur whispered, lowering the barrel as they stepped into the grand rotunda. The room was a slaughterhouse. Vesperan guards, proud warriors who had spent decades mastering the art of the dual plasma blade, lay scattered across the polished obsidian floor like broken toys. The high walls were pockmarked with deep, jagged craters left by kinetic slug impacts. Cassandra swallowed hard, forcing down the bile rising in her throat. They butchered them. Our shields didn't even slow them down. Energy shields are designed to disperse high-frequency plasma bursts and light-amplified lasers, Arthur said. His voice was entirely stripped of warmth, cold as interplanetary void. He knelt beside a fallen guard, quickly patting down the alien's utility belt. They used solid lead and depleted uranium slugs. It punches right through kinetic barriers before the field can equalize. Old technology. Primitive. But if your target isn't expecting it, it's devastatingly effective. He unclipped a small, metallic disc from the guard's belt and tossed it to Cassandra. "Clip that to your waist. It won't stop a direct slug, but it'll deflect sharp stone fragments if they start throwing explosives." Cassandra caught the device, her fingers brushing the cold metal. "You know their weapons. You know their exact tactics." Arthur stood up, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. The feral intensity in his gaze was still there, lurking just beneath the skin. "I wrote the manual they're using, Cassie." The words hung in the dusty air, heavy and suffocating. "Who sent you?" Cassandra asked, her voice steady despite the deep tremor in her chest. "The Earth Alliance told my father you were a diplomat. A minor noble from a pacified agricultural world. They swore you were harmless." Arthur let out a short, humorless breath. "Earth doesn't have minor nobles, Cassie. We have politicians, and we have weapons. I was the latter. For 15 years, I worked for the Syndicate, a Black Ops division operating completely outside official Alliance jurisdiction. We did the jobs the diplomats couldn't stomach. We erased threats. We dismantled regimes." He turned away, looking at the shattered remnants of a crystalline statue. "When the peace treaty with Vesper was drafted, Earth was terrified. Your species are apex predators. You conquer. You expand. The Alliance needed the treaty to hold, but they didn't trust your High Council. So they offered a political marriage. A gesture of ultimate goodwill and vulnerability." "A lamb," Cassandra murmured, the pieces finally snapping together in her mind. "No," Arthur said, turning back to her with a completely blank expression. "They embedded a deterrent. They sent me here so that if Vesper ever decided to break the treaty and march on Earth, I would be perfectly positioned to dismantle your entire royal leadership from the inside. I wasn't a hostage, Cassie. I was a sleeping nerve agent. A cold spike of betrayal pierced Cassandra's chest, but it was instantly swallowed by a wave of profound, awestruck respect. Vesperan culture worshipped strategy. They revered power and deception. Earth hadn't insulted them with a weakling, Earth had completely outplayed them. They had planted the most dangerous killer in the sector into the royal bedchamber, and he had spent 3 years politely pruning flowers. But you didn't do it, she said softly. You never gathered intelligence. You never mapped our defense grids. I was tired, Arthur whispered, the harsh edge in his voice cracking just a fraction. I was so damn tired of the blood. When they offered me this assignment, I took it because it was an exit strategy. A quiet life. And then I met you. He took a slow step toward her, his blood-stained hands trembling slightly. I wanted to be the man you thought I was. I wanted to be Arthur the gardener. I wanted to build something instead of tearing it down. A heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant crackle of an electrical fire. Cassandra took a step forward. She didn't flinch this time. She reached out and placed her hand over his blood-crusted fingers where they gripped the rifle. The man I thought you were is dead, she said, her voice dropping into an authoritative, regal command. I need the monster now. Can you be the monster for me, Arthur? Arthur looked down at her hand, then up into her dark, resolute eyes. The soft, gentle husband vanished completely. Yes, he said. The subterranean bunker beneath the west wing was a fortress of reinforced durasteel and lead plating. By the time Arthur and Cassandra bypassed the jammed security doors and stepped inside, the surviving leadership of Vesper was in a state of absolute chaos. General Harrison, the supreme commander of the Royal Guard, was slamming his massive fist onto a holographic tactical table. He was a mountain of an alien, his heavy armor scorched black, his face twisted in furious disbelief. Around him stood 4 high-ranking nobles, all shouting over one another. The orbital comms are completely dead. Lord Stanton yelled, pacing frantically. We can't signal the fleet. They took out the primary generators in the first 10 seconds. It's a surgical siege. Harrison barked, his deep voice echoing off the steel walls. We have maybe 30 guards left, and our plasma blades can't penetrate their kinetic plating. We need to locate the asset they're after and surrender it. They aren't here for an asset, a flat, quiet voice cut through the shouting. The room went dead silent. Harrison and the nobles turned toward the entrance. Cassandra stepped into the dim light of the bunker, her silk gown torn and caked in dust, but her posture commanding. Yet it wasn't the princess that held their stunned attention. It was the man standing beside her. Arthur stood bare-chested, his skin painted with the dried crimson of his enemies. He held a heavy military assault rifle with a casual, terrifying familiarity that made General Harrison's hand instantly fly to his sidearm. What is the meaning of this? Harrison demanded, recovering from his shock. Princess Cassandra, why is the human holding a war-grade firearm? Get him into the civilian shelter immediately. Hold your tongue, General, Cassandra snapped, her voice cutting like a whip. You will address my husband with the respect his body count demands. Harrison blinked, thoroughly confused. Body count? He's a gardener. He killed 3 heavily armored assault mercenaries in the greenhouse, Cassandra said, stepping up to the tactical table. Bare-handed. A stunned silence fell over the war council. Lord Stanton let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. Absurd. Those are professional strike teams. A fragile human couldn't dent their armor. Arthur ignored the noble entirely. He walked straight to the holographic table, his eyes scanning the blue-lit blueprints of the palace grounds. He leaned over the projection, his face bathed in the eerie light. There's Syndicate Black Ops, Arthur stated coldly, tapping a blinking cluster of red markers near the main gates. Command sent them to erase loose ends, starting with me. And since Vesperans are witnesses, they won't leave a single living soul in this palace. Surrender is not an option. They will accept your white flag, line you against the wall, and shoot you in the back of the head. You speak as if you know military doctrine, human, Harrison sneered. Though his eyes warily tracked the way Arthur handled his weapon. I know how they fight, Arthur said, looking up. His pale eyes were so cold that the veteran general involuntarily shifted his weight back. You fight with honor. You fight with line formations, shield walls, and formal duels. You fight like gentlemen. Arthur pointed a blood-stained finger at the southern courtyard on the map. They fight to win. Right now, they're funneling your surviving guards toward the southern courtyard. They're using narrow choke points to negate your size advantage, setting up crossfire arcs, and tearing your men to pieces. My men are holding the southern gates. Harrison roared defensively. They are the finest warriors in the sector. Your men are already dead, Arthur said softly. As if on cue, a series of muffled, heavy thuds vibrated through the thick ceiling. The holographic display flickered violently as the life signs of 20 Vesperan guards in the southern courtyard abruptly turned from healthy green to flatline gray. The color drained completely from General Harrison's face. Lord Stanton stumbled back, a wave of sheer terror washing over the room. How? How did you know that? Stanton whispered, his arrogance completely shattered. Because it's a textbook funnel, Arthur replied, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. They blew the eastern wall to make you think the main assault was coming from the flank. You rushed your heavy infantry south to cut them off, right into an automated crossfire trap. They used your own aggression against you. Cassandra watched her husband. He was magnificent, terrifying, but magnificent. The apologetic man was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating war machine that viewed the battlefield not as an arena of honor, but as a simple mathematical equation to be solved. What do we do? General Harrison asked. The command dynamic in the room had instantly shifted. He was no longer asking his princess. He was asking the human. Arthur looked down at the tactical map, his eyes narrowing. They've secured the outer perimeter. Next, they sweep the interior rooms. They have thermal optics, so hiding is useless. They have kinetic rounds, so your energy shields are useless. Then we die, Lord Stanton said bitterly. No, Arthur said. A slow, dark shadow of a smile crept onto his face. It wasn't his usual warm, gentle smile. It was the smile of an apex predator locking the cage from the inside. They think they're hunting a retired target and a room full of soft aristocrats, Arthur said softly. They think this is a routine cleanup job. He looked at Cassandra, and for a brief millisecond, the warmth returned to his eyes. Then he turned back to the Vesperan generals. We're going to teach them why I retired in the first place. The Royal Armory was a vast, vaulted hall housing the absolute pinnacle of Vesperan military engineering. Racks of sleek silver plasma rifles, elegant energy rapiers, and ultralight kinetic weave armor filled the chamber. Yet Arthur walked past every single piece of high-tech weaponry without giving it a second glance. General Harrison followed close behind, flanked by 6 surviving royal guards. The soldiers moved with tense, erratic steps, their confidence completely shattered by the silent slaughter of their brethren in the courtyards. They watched the bare-chested, blood-stained human with a mix of deep suspicion and desperate hope. None of this interests you? Harrison asked, gesturing to a heavy plasma cannon mounted on a swivel rig. This can melt through ship plating in seconds. They wear ablative ceramic plating, Arthur explained without breaking his stride as he reached the rear wall of the armory. Plasma superheats their outer shell, sure, but it takes 3 to 4 seconds of sustained fire to burn through to the skin. In 3 seconds, a syndicate operator will put 12 kinetic slugs into your chest. In a firefight, a 3-second time to kill is an eternity. You'd be dead long before they felt the heat. Arthur stopped in front of a heavy, dust-covered steel storage container tucked away in the corner. Cassie mentioned you confiscate illegal weapons from human traders operating on the border worlds. Where's the contraband? Harrison frowned, stepping forward to input his override code into the container's console. Here. But it is primitive garbage, human. Chemical propellants, crude metal casings, unrefined explosives. The heavy metal doors hissed open, revealing a dusty stockpile of seized human military hardware. To the Vesperans, it looked like a collection of museum relics and junk metal. To Arthur, it was an artist's palette. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy, matte black 12-gauge tactical shotgun. He gripped the slide and racked it back, clack-clack. The loud, mechanical metallic snap echoed sharply through the quiet armory. He inspected the receiver, satisfied, and began loading heavy buckshot shells into the magazine tube with practiced, rhythmic speed. Primitive is reliable, Arthur said calmly, slinging a bandolier of heavy shells across his bare, scarred chest. Next, he pulled out a black tactical load-bearing vest, tightening the straps around his torso. He filled the pouches with fragmentation grenades, flashbang canisters, and a pair of heavy, serrated combat knives. Cassandra stood near the archway, watching her husband transform. He was burying Arthur the gardener deep beneath layers of Kevlar, steel, and gunpowder. "General," Arthur said, turning back to the group. He pulled a heavy kinetic assault rifle from the crate and tossed it to Harrison. The massive Vesperan caught it clumsily. "Hold the stock tight against your shoulder," Arthur instructed, his tone sharp and commanding. "The mechanical recoil will fracture your collarbone if you hold it loose like a plasma weapon." He began handing out submachine guns, shotguns, and bandoliers of kinetic ammunition to the remaining guards. "Listen to me carefully," Arthur said, pacing slowly in front of the Vesperan warriors. His voice was low, but the sheer gravity in his tone commanded absolute, unbroken silence. "Forget your honor. Forget your academy training. If you stand in the open to challenge them, you die. If you try to engage them in a noble duel, you die." He stopped in front of a young Vesperan guard, whose hands were trembling so hard he could barely hold the weapon. "We are going to fight dirty," Arthur stated flatly. "We are going to hide in the pitch black. We are going to shoot them in the back of the head as they walk through doorways. When an enemy steps into a room, you do not announce yourself. You do not demand a surrender. You empty your entire magazine into the doorway until nothing moves." The young guard looked appalled. "But, that is cold-blooded execution. That is not honorable combat." Arthur stepped up to the young soldier, looking him dead in the eye. "They slaughtered your brothers in the rotunda while they were on their knees. Did they offer them a duel?" The young guard swallowed hard, lowering his eyes, and shook his head. "Combat is a fairy tale told by politicians to convince young men to die for them," Arthur whispered, his voice echoing with the weight of 1,000 dark memories. "Survival is the only truth in this room. Today, we survive." Arthur turned to General Harrison. "Take your men and set up a defensive choke point on the second landing of the grand stairwell. Barricade the high ground with marble benches. When they try to push up the stairs, rain fire down on them. Do not let them advance past the landing." "And what will you be doing?" Harrison asked, gripping the human rifle tightly. "I'm going hunting," Arthur said. He walked over to Cassandra. The guards respectfully stepped back, giving them space. Arthur stopped a foot away from her. He reached out his blood-streaked hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently cupping her cheek. His thumb softly stroked her skin. The touch was so impossibly tender, so heartbreakingly familiar, that a tear welled up in the corner of Cassandra's eye. "I need you to return to the bunker, Cassie," he murmured gently. "Lock the heavy blast door. Don't open it for anyone. Not until you hear my voice." Cassandra looked at the tactical gear, the brutal weapons, and the icy resolve in his eyes. "Will you come back to me?" Arthur offered a faint, genuine smile, the soft husband returning for a fleeting second. I made a vow, Cassie. In sickness and in health, till death do us part. They are trained killers, Arthur, she whispered, her heart aching. There are dozens of them left. I know, Arthur said, his smile fading into something terrifyingly dark as he racked the shotgun again. They're locked in a palace with me. I almost feel sorry for them. He turned on his heel and walked into the dark, smoke-filled corridor, his footsteps completely silent as the shadows swallowed him whole. Cassandra watched him vanish. The hardened, cynical core of her Vesperan soul, raised on the philosophy of apex dominance, realized a terrifying truth. Humanity was not a soft species. They had simply evolved past the need to constantly display their teeth. They kept their monsters locked in cages of domesticity, dressed in linen shirts and working in flower gardens. Simply because they knew what absolute devastation would occur if they ever let them off the chain. She turned back to General Harrison, her royal authority fully restored. You heard my husband, General. Fortify the stairwell, and pray for the souls of anyone who crosses his path. The main power grid of the eastern wing failed with a dying, mechanical groan. The low emergency strobes flickered once, twice, and died completely. Total, suffocating darkness swallowed the long, art-lined galleries of the royal spire. A four-man syndicate sweep team moved silently through the pitch-black corridor. Their heavy night vision visors painted the world in a grainy, sickly green glow. They moved in a standard diamond formation, tight, professional, lethal, their kinetic assault rifles held at the ready, laser sights slicing through the drifting smoke like red razor wire. Comms are still completely jammed, Bennett whispered, his voice a digitized crackle over the squad's encrypted local channel. I can't raise Gregory's team in the greenhouse. Gregory is dead, the squad leader, Carter, replied flatly, without breaking his sweep. Focus on your sector. The asset is loose. Damien said the target was pacified, another mercenary, Reed, muttered, his rifle twitching nervously toward a falling piece of cracked plaster. Said Penhaligon spent 3 years drinking alien tea, painting pictures, and growing flowers. Said he'd gone soft. Carter stopped for a fraction of a second, his visor scanning a dark archway. Arthur Penhaligon didn't go soft, Reed. He got bored. Keep your eyes up and your mouth shut. They passed beneath a massive, vaulted doorway. The architecture of the Vesperan palace was designed for giants, leaving vast expanses of recessed alcoves, towering pillars, and shadowed ceiling rafters high above. It was a sniper's nightmare. It was a cleaner's playground. High above them, clinging to the carved stone molding near the ceiling like an arachnid, Arthur watched the green laser sight sweep the marble floor beneath him. He wasn't breathing. Through sheer, terrifying physical control, he had slowed his heart rate to a sluggish 40 beats per minute. His core temperature was dropping, masking his thermal signature from their thermal optics. This was old syndicate conditioning, drilled into his bones over 15 years of Black Ops warfare. He had spent 3 years trying to override it with soil pH levels, botanical names, and the sound of Cassandra's laugh. It had taken less than 10 minutes to bring it all back to the surface. Arthur silently drew a matte black combat knife from his chest rig. He waited until the four-man formation passed directly beneath the central crystal chandelier. He didn't jump down. Dropping made noise. Instead, Arthur unspooled a length of high-tensile climbing wire, looped it around a ceiling beam, and lowered himself into the blind spot directly behind the rear guard. The mercenary never even felt the shift in air pressure. Arthur's left hand clapped over the man's mouth grill, violently jerking his helmet back. At the exact same millisecond, Arthur drove the combat knife upward, sliding the 6-inch blade smoothly beneath the base of the helmet, completely severing the brain stem. The man went instantly limp. Arthur didn't let the body crash to the floor. He caught the full weight, lowering the corpse silently to the marble tiles. He unclipped a thermal flare grenade from the dead man's belt, pulled the pin, and rolled it down the hall in the opposite direction. Arthur slipped behind a heavy velvet curtain just as the thermal flare detonated. It didn't explode with shrapnel, it unleashed a blinding, localized flash of extreme white heat. To the 3 remaining mercenaries using thermal optics, it was the equivalent of staring directly into a dying star. Contact. Optics blinded. Carter screamed, tearing his helmet off as his retinas burned. Panic shattered the diamond formation. Reed fired his weapon wildly into the blinding white haze, the deafening roar of kinetic rounds tearing ancient tapestries to shreds and shattering marble pillars. Arthur stepped out from behind the velvet curtain. He didn't rush. He walked with a calm, terrifying precision. He raised the tactical shotgun. Boom! The heavy buckshot caught Reed in the side of his knee, finding the unarmored joint gap. The leg instantly disintegrated. Reed collapsed into his own blood, shrieking as his rifle clattered away. Bennett spun toward the muzzle flash, raising his weapon, but Arthur racked the shotgun, clack, and fired again. The point-blank blast caught Bennett square in the chest. The heavy ceramic armor stopped the penetration, but the sheer kinetic energy of a 12-gauge shell at 3 feet shattered his ribs and launched him backward into a stone pillar. He slumped to the floor, coughing blood inside his visor. Carter, his vision still swimming with bright white spots, pulled his sidearm and blindly fired toward the shadows. "Penhaligon, you son of a bitch!" Arthur dropped the shotgun, letting it hang from its tactical sling. In one fluid motion, he drew his second combat knife and threw it. The heavy blade spun end over end through the smoke, burying itself to the hilt in Carter's exposed throat. Carter dropped his gun. His hands flew to his neck, his eyes wide with shock as he fell to his knees. He gasped, drowning on his own blood, staring up at the shadow stepping out of the red emergency light. Arthur walked over to the dying squad leader. His face was a mask of carved stone. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel triumph. He felt only an exhausting, crushing emptiness. "I told command I was out, Carter," Arthur whispered softly, kneeling beside the man. "I gave them 15 years. I gave them my soul. All I asked for was a garden." Carter choked, a bloody bubble popping on his lips, before his eyes glazed over. Arthur reached out and gently closed the dead man's eyes. He stood up, retrieved his knife, wiped the blade clean on Carter's vest, and picked up his shotgun. He fed 3 more shells into the tubular magazine. 3 squads down, Arthur muttered into the dark. 2 to go. The grand stairwell was a meat grinder of a different kind. General Harrison crouched behind a hastily constructed barricade of overturned marble benches and heavy steel doors on the second landing. The air was thick with blinding gray smoke, the chemical bite of burnt cordite, and the sharp, iron stench of Vesperan blood. "Reloading," yelled the young guard beside him, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his magazine twice before slamming it into the seized human submachine gun. "Keep your heads down and maintain fire," Harrison roared, leaning over the barricade to blindly unload a burst from his heavy kinetic assault rifle. The heavy human rifle kicked against his shoulder like an angry beast, brutal and clumsy compared to the delicate hum of a Vesperan plasma blade. But after seeing a syndicate mercenary's ceramic armor shatter and cave under sustained kinetic fire, Harrison had become a firm believer. They were holding the line, but they were running out of time and blood. At the base of the towering stairwell, the remaining syndicate forces were regrouping. Damien, the commander of the extraction team, stood behind the massive stone pillar supporting the central arch. He was a mountain of a man clad in heavy siege-grade armor, his black helmet scratched and notched with dozens of kill tallies. Damien was utterly furious. This was supposed to be a surgical strike, in, execution, out, in less than 20 minutes. Instead, 3 of his veteran squads had gone dead silent, and he was being pinned down by alien aristocrats using primitive gunpowder weapons. "Lay down heavy suppressing fire." Damien barked into his helmet comms, his voice distorted by anger. Bring up the rotary cannon. We're going to chew that balcony to dust. Two heavily armored mercenaries stepped out from behind the flank pillars, pouring a continuous hail of automatic fire into the second landing. Shrapnel and pulverized marble rained over Harrison's men. Behind the suppressing fire, a third mercenary dragged a heavy, belt-fed kinetic rotary cannon into position, locking its heavy bipod onto the polished floor. Harrison heard the mechanical spooling of the rotary barrels, a sound like a rising storm. He looked down his defensive line. Only 3 guards remained standing. Lord Stanton was propped against the far wall, clutching a deep gut wound, whimpering softly in the dark. The romanticism of Vesperan warfare, the noble duels, the honorable deaths under the sun, had evaporated into thin air. This was just industrial slaughter. Brace yourselves. Harrison yelled, drawing his plasma blade with his left hand. If the barricade crumbled, he would charge down the steps and die like a warrior of Vesper. The rotary cannon began to roar, a deafening, continuous sound like tearing canvas. The marble barricade began to disintegrate under the sheer volume of lead. Prepare to push. Damien yelled, racking his heavy shotgun. Leave no survivors. Damien never got to give the order to advance. From the vaulted ceiling 3 stories directly above the stairwell, a shadow detached itself from the iron rafters. Arthur had bypassed the main corridors entirely, scaling the exterior elevator shafts to reach the high balconies. He looked down at the clustered mercenary formation below. He pulled the pins on 3 fragmentation grenades, holding the spoons down, counting the seconds in his head with terrifying precision. 1. 2. 3. He dropped them. The grenades fell like stones, detonating the exact millisecond they reached head height above the mercenary unit. They didn't hit the floor, they airburst. A concussive shockwave shook the structural foundations of the palace. A lethal umbrella of shrapnel shredded the mercenary manning the rotary cannon, his heavy armor failing under the omnidirectional blast. The heavy weapon silenced instantly. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, Arthur vaulted over the 3rd-story railing. He fell 30 feet, landing heavily on the corpse of a fallen mercenary to absorb the impact. The sickening crunch of armor and bone echoed through the hall. Arthur rolled instantly to his feet, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in his left ankle. He was right in the middle of them. Where Vesperans fought from a distance with blades and syndicate operators fought from cover, Arthur fought in the absolute, chaotic center. He didn't use the shotgun, it was too long, too unwieldy for this range. He drew both combat knives. He moved with a speed that defied basic human biology, a blur of calculated, lethal geometry. He stepped inside the guard of a recovering mercenary, driving his left knife up under the chin and his right knife straight into the femoral artery. He spun, using the dying man's momentum to throw himself into the next target. "It's Penhaligon," someone screamed in panic. A mercenary tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Arthur was already beneath the barrel. He grabbed the hot metal barrel with his bare hand, violently redirecting it as the man panicked and fired, sending a spray of lead directly into another mercenary's chest. Arthur slashed the man's throat, then drove the solid metal pommel of his knife into his visor, shattering the faceplate. Harrison watched from the balcony, entirely paralyzed. The young guard beside him stopped firing. They weren't watching a battle, they were witnessing a natural disaster. It wasn't combat, it was a harvest. "Artie!" Damien bellowed in blind rage, throwing a wounded mercenary aside to get a clear line of sight. He raised his heavy shotgun. Arthur turned to face him. He was covered head to toe in blood, his chest heaving, his bare skin slick with sweat and gore. He looked at the extraction commander with eyes that were completely, chillingly hollow. Damien pulled the trigger. Arthur dived sideways, but the spread was too wide. A single heavy pellet of buckshot caught him in the left shoulder, tearing through the muscle. Arthur grunted, rolling violently across the slick marble floor and coming up behind the shattered remains of a decorative stone fountain. You think you can hide from me, Artie? Damien taunted, slowly advancing, racking his shotgun with a heavy mechanical snap. You've gotten slow. The garden made you soft. You talk too much, Damien, Arthur's voice echoed from behind the stone. It didn't sound pained. It sounded bored. I'm going to mount your head on the command console. Damien sneered, stepping around the edge of the fountain with his weapon raised. He found nothing but a pool of fresh blood. Arthur had never stopped moving. He had rolled behind the fountain, kicked off the back wall, and scrambled up the sheer face of the ruined statue in the center. As Damien stepped around the base, Arthur dropped down on him from above. It wasn't elegant. It was raw, ugly violence. Arthur's knees slammed into Damien's heavy shoulders, driving the massive man face-first into the marble. Damien roared, trying to throw the smaller man off, but Arthur wrapped his uninjured arm around Damien's neck, locking in a suffocating chokehold. Damien thrashed violently, slamming Arthur backward into the stone pillar again and again. Arthur's vision flashed white with agony, but his grip remained an iron vice. He reached down with his right hand, grabbed the fallen shotgun Damien had dropped, and shoved the barrel directly into the narrow gap between Damien's backplate and helmet. Tell command, Arthur whispered, his voice a ragged, breathless rasp directly into Damien's ear, that the gardener says hello. He pulled the trigger. The deafening blast echoed through the ruin of the stairwell. Damien's body went completely rigid, then slumped into an immovable heap. Arthur slowly untangled himself from the corpse. He dragged himself to his feet, swaying heavily. Blood poured freely from his shoulder, mixing with sweat and enemy gore. The grand stairwell was dead silent. The assault was over. Arthur looked up at the balcony. General Harrison was staring down at him. The Vesperan Supreme Commander, a veteran of 100 planetary campaigns, slowly lowered his weapon. He didn't look at Arthur with contempt or superiority. He looked at him with profound, absolute reverence. Arthur didn't salute. He didn't say a word. He simply dropped the empty shotgun, turned on his heel, and began the long, agonizing walk back to the bunker. He had to check on Cassie. The heavy hydraulic seals of the subterranean bunker hissed, a long, mechanical exhalation that sounded entirely too much like a dying breath. Inside the sterile, white-lit chamber, the air was thick with the suffocating stench of pure panic. Princess Cassandra stood in the dead center of the room, her body locked in a firm combat stance. She held a heavy plasma pistol in a two-handed grip, the glowing blue barrel aimed directly at the slowly parting durasteel blast doors. Behind her, the surviving members of the Vesperan royal court huddled against the far wall like cornered prey. These were aristocrats who had spent their entire lives wrapped in the mythology of imperial dominance. They had hunted dangerous beasts for sport and engaged in formal plasma duels over minor social slights. Now, stripped of their kinetic shields and orbital fleets, they were weeping in the dark. Seasonal smoke from the burning galleries above curled into the clean room. The dark silhouette that limped through the haze was not a heavily armored syndicate operative. It was a man. Arthur staggered into the room. He did not look like a triumphant savior, and he certainly did not resemble a hero from the Vesperan war epics. He looked completely shattered. His bare torso was a terrifying canvas of deep violet contusions, jagged cuts, and fresh bullet grazes. His left shoulder was a ruined mess of torn muscle and scorched flesh where the shotgun pellet had caught him, his left arm hanging completely useless at his side. Dark, thick blood coated him from his jawline down to his waist, dripping steadily from his fingertips onto the polished white floor with a sickening tap-tap-tap. He stopped 3 paces into the bunker. His pale blue eyes were sunken, hollowed out by the crushing physical and mental toll of dragging his body through hell. The cold, mechanical calculation of the syndicate cleaner was rapidly evaporating from his face, leaving behind only raw, overwhelming exhaustion. Cassandra did not lower her weapon immediately. She stared at him, her chest heaving, searching his features for the dark predator she had unleashed in the palace corridors. But the monster was gone. Arthur looked down at his hands, seeing them caked in a thick, drying crust of deep crimson. A violent, uncontrollable tremor racked his frame. His chest hitched in shallow, ragged gasps as the psychological shock of reliving his dark past came crashing down on him. "Cassie!" he rasped. His voice was a fragile, trembling whisper. He took a hesitant step backward, suddenly hyper-aware of the clean bunker tiles and the grotesque state of his own body. "I'm sorry. I'm tracking blood everywhere." Cassandra let go of the plasma pistol. The heavy weapon clattered loudly against the deck. She didn't care about the blood. She didn't care about the terrified gasps of the court behind her. She crossed the room in 3 long strides. Arthur flinched instinctively as she approached, trying to turn his ruined shoulder away so he wouldn't ruin her dress. "Don't, Cassie, please. I'm filthy." "Shut up, Arthur," she whispered fiercely. Cassandra threw her arms around his neck, burying her face into his uninjured shoulder. His skin was freezing cold, smelling heavily of copper, burnt powder, and sweat. He felt completely rigid for a fraction of a second, his muscles locked in the permanent, paranoid tension of a soldier expecting a blade in the dark. Then, he broke. Arthur let out a ragged, tearing sob. He wrapped his good arm tightly around her waist, pulling her close, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He held on to her with a desperate, crushing grip, as if she were the only anchor keeping him from drifting away into the pitch-black void forever. The violent tremors shaking his frame transferred into hers, but she simply held him tighter, gently stroking his blood-matted hair. Behind them, the Vesperan nobles watched in stunned, absolute silence. Lord Stanton, the man who had mockingly sneered at Arthur's dirty fingernails only hours earlier, pressed his back flush against the wall, trembling in visceral fear. The internal comms had already relayed the sheer scale of the carnage upstairs. They knew what this human had done. He had dismantled an elite Black Ops siege force using museum relics, garden tools, and his bare hands. He had turned their legendary palace into a slaughterhouse. Stanton stared at Arthur, his mind struggling to reconcile his reality. The High Court finally understood the terrifying truth about the Earth Alliance. Humanity had not sent a weakling to insult them. Humanity was a species that had perfected the mechanics of industrial murder so thoroughly, so completely, that it had poisoned their very souls. They chose diplomacy, agriculture, and quiet lives not because they were weak, but because they knew that once they started killing, they didn't know how to stop. Earth had taken a weapon of mass destruction, dressed him in a linen shirt, and asked politely for a trade deal. "You're safe," Arthur whispered into Cassandra's ear, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air scrubbers. "They're gone. I swept the perimeter. I killed them all." "I know," she soothed gently, her hand tracing his jawline. "I know, my love. It's over." Arthur pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his gaze wide, glassy, and pleading for absolution. "The hydrangeas, Cassie." Damien threw a grenade near the east corridor. The shockwave shattered the glass roof, the chemical ash is going to ruin the soil. A small, heartbreakingly genuine smile broke across Cassandra's face. Despite the horror of the night, despite the bodies piled in the hallways, the soft core of her husband remained intact. He was still desperately clinging to the dirt, to the peaceful life he had fought so hard to build. "We will replant them, Arthur," she said softly, gently guiding him toward the emergency medical cot. "We have the rest of our lives to make things grow. I promise you." The heavy hydraulic blast doors hissed open one final time. General Harrison stepped into the sterile light of the bunker. The Supreme Commander of the Royal Guard looked as though he had been dragged through an orbital debris field. His kinetic weave armor was scorched black, and blood trickled from a deep laceration on his forehead. In his hands, he carried the heavy human assault rifle Arthur had given him, holding it with rigid, disciplined care. Harrison stopped just inside the threshold. He looked at the bloody, trembling human sitting on the edge of the medical cot, resting his head against the princess's hip while she tended to his wounds. The general did not say a word. He simply let the heavy rifle hang on its tactical sling, snapped his massive boots together, and slammed his right fist across his chest in a crisp, sharp blow. He held the position without flinching. It was the highest, most sacred martial salute in Vesperan culture, an honor reserved exclusively for conquering kings, legendary commanders, and mythical heroes. For a long, breathless moment, Arthur didn't even notice. He was staring quietly at the floor, his mind already miles away, calculating how many days it would take to clear the shattered glass from the flower beds and rebuild the irrigation lines. Word of the siege of the royal spire spread across the galaxy like wildfire, but not in the way the Syndicate or the Earth Alliance had originally planned. There were no official press releases, no diplomatic hand-wringing, and no declarations of war. The Earth Alliance silently disavowed the rogue Blackwood unit, brushing the incident off as an unauthorized mercenary operation. The Vesperan High Council quietly buried the casualties and released a short, formal statement affirming the absolute strength of the bilateral trade treaty. But among the shadow networks, the mercenary guilds, and the high-level military councils of the galaxy, the true story filtered out in terrified, hushed tones. They spoke of 30 heavily armored, elite syndicate operators, men equipped with the finest stealth and kinetic technology in the sector, entering a palace defended by a single retired human. They spoke of how those 30 men were dismantled in under an hour, not by an army or an orbital strike, but by a bare-chested gardener wielding rusted pruning shears, 12-gauge shotguns, and spatial geometry. A new, chilling doctrine began to rewrite galactic politics. When alien empires looked at Earth from that day forward, they no longer saw fragile diplomats, eager merchants, or soft-spoken farmers. They saw a species that kept its darkest nightmares wrapped in domesticity, restrained by linen shirts, hot tea, and quiet gardens simply because they understood the horrific cost of letting them loose. The galaxy learned a fundamental truth: do not push the humans. Do not test their patience. And above all, do not disturb their peace. Because beneath their gentle smiles and quiet lives, they are all just resting monsters, desperately trying to stay asleep. 3 months later, the afternoon sun washed over the restored glass dome of the royal greenhouse. The air was warm, humid, and smelled of fresh, rich earth. Sunlight filtered through crystal-clear glass, illuminating rows of vibrant, blooming flora. Arthur sat on his small wooden stool in the main aisle, holding a pair of brand-new, polished steel pruning shears. His left shoulder was bound in light medical tape, but his hands were steady. He hummed a slow, tuneless melody from Earth as he carefully trimmed a dead leaf from a vibrant cluster of deep blue hydrangeas. Footsteps echoed softly on the terracotta tiles. Arthur looked up and smiled. Cassandra stepped into the aisle, draped in her regal royal robes, carrying 2 steaming mugs of warm chamomile tea. "The planetary governor's replacement arrives in an hour," Cassandra said, handing him a mug and sitting beside him on the wooden bench. He requested a private audience to discuss the new grain shipments. Arthur took a quiet sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. "Is he polite?" Cassandra laughed softly, leaning her head against his uninjured shoulder. "Extremely polite, my love. In fact, he specifically asked if he could bring you a rare botanical cutting from his home world as a gesture of deep respect." Arthur crinkled his eyes, a genuine, soft smile breaking across his face. "Well then," Arthur said, setting his mug down and picking up his pruning shears. "Tell him he's welcome anytime."